Hello, everyone, and welcome to Salesforce and the CIA Tradecraft you need to know to protect large data volumes. My name is Susannah St. Germain, and I'm a Salesforce MVP. I also have 21 Salesforce certifications, and I am currently a technical architect at Odaseva, which is an ISV working in the Salesforce ecosystem. I'm also very active on Twitter, so if you'd like to keep the conversation going beyond the chat in this session today, please give me a follow and we can pick up where we left off. And finally, before we get started, just a huge thank you to all of our sponsors who you can see on the screen. This event would not be possible without them. Okay, so to get started, let's talk about data. If you're like me, as an admin or a developer or as an architect, you might not think about data all day. And that's perfectly normal, right? We're usually thinking about automation or how to maybe create a cool new flow with all the new flow features that are coming out, or how to write some code, and maybe even how to solve a business requirement with just a really, really simple and creative solution. And unless you're practicing for the CTA exam, you might not have requirements that talk about data concerns. That might not be something that's forefront with your customers and your employers. But today, I'm here to prove that we all in the ecosystem should be more focused on data, because that's truly why we're all here. That's why our employers have purchased Salesforce. That's why we're working in the ecosystem today. And that's why we take opportunities like this to learn and really contribute back to the community. So bear with me while I try to make this case to you. Okay, so we know that behind every interaction and device is a customer, and that these customers expect your business to deliver a consistent and personalized experience to them through every interaction, right? This is the big audacious dream speech that Mark Benioff gives at all the Dreamforces for the last 7 years. This idea of the connected customer. And the fact of the matter is that it's coming true. Nearly 80% of customers say that the experiences that a company provides, so the experiences that a company provides, are as important as the products or services that it creates or formally provides, right? So, as a business or as your company or as your nonprofit, how do you go about understanding and learning about your customers so that you can deliver that personalized experience? Well, you can see them only through the lens of the data that they entrust to you. So the data that they give you is how you're able to create that personalized experience. And at the end of the day is the reason why we're all creating all this cool automation and writing code and doing all the things that we do in the Salesforce ecosystem. Okay, so we need customer information. So earning a customer's trust in order to get that data should be easy, right? Well, even when we create a really awesome form with all these validations and maybe a really flashy lightning web component, and we're really happy and we know that it's going to be used the way it needs to be because we've used all the bells and whistles of Salesforce. Well, the fact of the matter is that even after creating all of these cool things with the Salesforce platform, 75% of customers don't trust businesses with their data. And they actually have a fair enough reason not to. And that's because 30% of businesses have a data incident each year. And that data incident doesn't need to look like a huge hack or a big data breach. The fact of the matter is that most of the time, a data incident is due to just like fat finger mistakes, due to an end user accidentally deleting an account or a contact, or even a level beyond that, maybe an integration that's gone wrong, or there's some buggy code that's changing records and doing something that we don't want that code to do. So, and in addition to that, very apropos to this conference today, 86% of businesses are not ready for privacy regulations. So things like the GDPR and the CCPA, businesses are not ready to implement those privacy regulations that customers expect. And it's really, frankly, demanded by those businesses. So if customers don't trust your company, they won't give you the data that's needed to personalize that experience that we've talked about on the previous slide that's expected. And if businesses aren't creating that connected customer experience, the fact of the matter is that they're losing out to their competitors that are providing that experience. So I hope that I've painted a bit of a picture to convince you that data truly is your company's most important resource. And it's really the reason we're all here. So it's something that we need to be educated about and need to be thinking about on a daily basis. Okay. So now that I've made my case, I'd like to dive into a bit of a data pop quiz just to level set and see where we all are at in our knowledge around data and data protection. So you can shout out the answer on mute. You can type the answer into the chat if you'd like. It's a short little quiz, and I will give you the answers after we run through it. So the first question. It's Salesforce's responsibility to protect my data. True or false? And I'll give you guys a second to think about it. Go ahead, debate in the chat. Okay, question number 2. I can use the weekly export to recover my data quickly. True or false? I wish I had Jeopardy music here. It's the one thing that's missing. Okay, question number 3. Salesforce Premier Plus support can restore my data if I need them to. True or false? And then our final question. It's possible to roll back the Salesforce database in order to recover your data at a certain point in time. True or false? Okay. So pens down. How did you do? Well, if you guessed that all of the answers to those questions were false, then you would be correct. But if you didn't answer all of the questions false, you're not alone. So ESG recently conducted a study on data protection regarded to software as a service, or in relation to software as a service. And they found that 1 out of 3 CIOs actually believe that SaaS applications like Salesforce don't need to be backed up. So that's this 33% not needed in yellow that you see on the screen. And instead, CIOs said that they regularly relied on the SaaS vendor alone. They relied on the SaaS vendor entirely to protect their data. So that's over here saying that they rely on Salesforce to protect their data, in this pie chart on the right. So if you did answer all the questions correctly, or even if you answered some of them correctly, I think you'll agree that we need to do some education with our leaders and with our CIOs as admins, developers, and architects. This is a really big knowledge gap that we need to start to fill so that all of our employees or employers can better protect their data from the human error we talked about or that buggy code. And even Salesforce has said that every Salesforce implementation should include or must include a data protection plan. So now that we know data is important, right? We know that our SaaS vendor, in our case, Salesforce, does not necessarily, right, back up our data. We're going to talk about that more. Let's take a deep dive into who protects what in the cloud, so we're all on the same page. Okay, so on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see our traditional database technology. So this might be like an on-premise system in comparison to Salesforce. And what the slide is showing, that if there were a database hardware failure, so maybe a fire in the server room or something like that, with a traditional database technology, the customer would be on the hook to help recover from that database hardware failure. And that would be something that would require some level of complexity from the customer. And one of the reasons that we've all chose Salesforce as our partner to host our applications is that we can reduce that complexity when we use a software as a service provider. So if there is a fire in the server room at Salesforce customers don't need to do anything about that. The customer complexity is low. But what about data loss? So there's hardware failure, but what about partial data loss, that human error or that malicious attack that we've talked about? Well, with a traditional database technology or an on-prem system, there's a concept of being able to roll back your data to a certain point in time. You can roll back the server and get that the picture of your data prior to the data loss or the malicious attack. That's something you have access to. You own the hardware. You can do what you need to do with that hardware. But with Salesforce, we all know that we're operating in a multi-tenant environment. We do not, as Salesforce customers, have direct access to the Salesforce servers, and neither do any vendors or even partners and closely coupled partners like Heroku. There's not direct access to the Salesforce servers. So that's why you see this gray box here. So how do we actually start getting access to data? If we need to protect it, if we need to be worried about it, how do we get data out of Salesforce? Well, most or many traditional database technologies might provide an API to interface with the system. And Salesforce, as we know, was built as API first. So the primary way, and frankly, the only way to get data in and out of the Salesforce platform is via the APIs. And you'll see with the little gauge that this is something that comes with a fair amount of complexity. If you've ever worked with any of the APIs or maybe faced some other governor limits with the Salesforce platform, you'll know that because of that multi-tenant architecture, there are different rules and limits with how we can interface with the APIs. And so it's very important, and we're going to talk about this in a few minutes, to understand the rules of the road of these particular limits so that you can get your data out and back in the case of a data loss. Okay. So now that you've learned that data protection is your responsibility, it's not something that Salesforce is responsible for, right? So how are you going to start to build this muscle? How are you going to manage this amongst all the other things that you're doing with your daily job as an admin, developer, architect? And where do you even start? Well, you aren't going to become an expert overnight. And frankly, between you and me and everyone watching this session, you probably never will, because the information security space is incredibly complex. But what we're going to talk about today is how you can start to know enough to ask the right questions and really start your company on their data protection journey. So today, what we're going to talk about is a model that you can start to use to ask the right types of questions that are going to better drive your decision making around the security of your data in your Salesforce org. So this is called the CIA Triad, and it is a model that was designed to guide policies for information security within an organization. So this is not a Salesforce thing. This is an information security standard that we can apply to the way that we protect our data in Salesforce. And the elements of the triad that you can see on the screen are considered to be the three most crucial components of security. And in this context, we'll deep dive into how this all applies to Salesforce. But in this context, confidentiality is a set of rules that limits access to information. Integrity is the assurance that the information that you have is accurate and trustworthy. And then availability, surprise, surprise, is the guarantee of reliable access, the availability of access to that data or that information by authorized people. So let's dive into each one of these legs of the triad and get to know them a little bit better. Okay, so confidentiality, a set of rules that limits access to information. Well, what are we actually talking about in Salesforce terms? Well, if you've ever studied for the admin exam, you know that the concept of who sees what is a key tenet of the way that the Salesforce platform was constructed. And there are tons of different ways to configure the platform to guarantee that data, and particularly sensitive data, is protected from unauthorized access. So you'll see on the screen here, there are things like profiles and permission sets, roles. We also have lots of security levers that we can pull, things like password policies, API settings. We can create high assurance sessions. So making an individual session require another level of security. And out of the box, Salesforce offers things like two-factor authentication, which is very quickly or has already become a standard that is highly recommended to be leveraged by everyone using the platform. And in the age of GDPR, we have a whole nother set of considerations that we should be thinking about as admins and developers and architects on the Salesforce platform. And that is items around privacy, right? So you might hear the term privacy by design, and the fact that privacy should be a basic design consideration. And with GDPR, there's a number of items to think through, but two of the most common ones that you'll find are the concept of anonymizing your data because of a data request. Someone wants to be forgotten, the right to be forgotten, as an example. In order to meet that sort of requirement, that data requirement, you can choose to anonymize particular pieces of information. And as an example, to do that, you would potentially turn the name John Smith, as an example, into a scramble of letters and numbers. But this can have significant downstream impacts if you were using that information for your business process or even for something as simple as testing. You might need to still have contextual information or with that business context still in your database. And in order to meet that particular requirement, you could look to do something called pseudo anonymization. And in our first example, that would be turning the name John Smith into another name, maybe James Halton, just as an example. Another name, still a male name, but it has removed the personal identifiable information from the system to a satisfactory amount. So these are all different confidentiality considerations that you should be thinking about when you think about protecting your data and ensuring that you have this data protection plan. And while it may sound like a lot of things to manage, even in this first leg of the triad, my trick of the trade that I would recommend to you, regardless of your data volumes in this case, is to take the first step of categorizing your data. So Salesforce has come out with new classification metadata that you'll find on all standard and custom objects. And it allows you to document what types of information you're storing in a particular field, just as an example. And then you can also indicate using that metadata how sensitive that data is. So what level of sensitivity and what type of data it is. So you can then make decisions around how you need to ensure the confidentiality of that particular piece of data. That's confidentiality. Let's dive into integrity because that's where things really start to get interesting. So, integrity is the assurance that the information that you have is trustworthy and accurate. And it truly pertains to protecting your data as it moves through a business application or through your Salesforce system or from even an outside system to Salesforce and back again. And there are, again, a number of out of the box tools that provide integrity support for your Salesforce data. So examples of that might be using the audit trail. So the out of the box audit trail allows you to see and have visibility into who is changing individual pieces of information. So you're able to track track that. Maybe someone deleted a field and all of that data that was stored in that field has now been deleted. There's also things like event monitoring that you can see who is accessing reports, who's doing what in the system. Are there any security concerns? And then one of my favorite ways, sort of simple out of the box way to monitor your data integrity is via out of the box reporting. So when we speak about data integrity, it also applies to completeness, right? You want to make sure the data that your users are inputting into the system is complete as possible. So you could create reports and see how much of the data that you expect to be there is populated. Another great integrity tool to have in your tool set that some people don't think about as a data integrity tool is writing good code coverage. So we mentioned early on in the session that data hacks or big data malicious data breaches are not the most common data corruption. Integrations or buggy code happen every day and corrupt data, oftentimes without people knowing. So, in order to prevent that from happening, having good code coverage with asserts that are proving that your code is doing what you expect it to do is a great way to help shore up your data integrity in your Salesforce environment. And then finally, the big sort of elephant in the room, you can talk about backups. So back to integrity, that's the assurance that the information you have is trustworthy and accurate. You want to have the integrity of your data. So one of the ways that most Salesforce customers ensure that their data has integrity, even beyond what might happen with a data corruption or a data loss, is to back up their data outside of Salesforce. And that can come with, using the weekly export. You can use the data loader to export information from your Salesforce environment, or you could use, of course, a partner to do some fancier backups and some maybe more when you're working with large data volumes. One thing to keep in mind is that the data loader, just as an example, has a limit of 5 million records. So if you're looking to back up 15 million records, that's definitely an area where you would want to investigate working with a partner to find the best solution to extract that information. And I would be remiss if I didn't hit on the fact that there's not just one type of backup. There's the concept of a full backup. So that's all of the information in your Salesforce environment. There's also the concept of an incremental backup. So only backing up things that have changed since the previous backup. And then you also will see some customers using synthetic backups. And that essentially means blending together one or more than one backup, maybe a full and an incremental backup as an example. And protecting the idea of integrity, right? If we circle back to the definition, is again protecting the accuracy of your data as it moves through your business applications, and knowing how to handle a data loss or corruption if it were to occur is going to be a great segue into our final leg of the triad. But before I do that, I do want to speak briefly about the LDV concern. So we already mentioned large data volumes. The data loader maxes out right at 5 million. What do you do if you need to start working with and extracting information with millions or information that has millions and millions of records in a particular table? So to ensure that you have integrity and access to that information, one of the topics that I speak a lot about, and I think is another one of those great questions and things to have in your toolkit, is thinking about, well, how am I going to query information? So as we looked at in the previous slide, the only way to get information in and out of Salesforce is via the Salesforce APIs. And that's true if you're working with a partner. That's true if you're working with the data loader, which uses the SOAP API or the bulk API, if you check the little box. So understanding how querying works under the hood is a very important piece of information that you can have as a Salesforce professional. And one of those things that I'll just briefly touch on is the fact that when you're querying, you're using the Salesforce object query language, and like the APIs, that also comes along with its own set of limits. And Salesforce will time you out if you try to run too complex of a query that might do what's called a full table scan to pull back millions and millions of records. So it's important to know how to make your queries what's called selective. And there's a great Trailhead module that I'll share with you all that talks about writing efficient queries and why that's important. But it's incredibly important when we speak about integrity, because in order to have that assurance and have that backup of your information, you need to make sure that you're querying in the right way to get your information out. So it might look like at a high level, again, look like using indexes in your queries, maybe even creating custom indexes, and also making sure that, again, you're aware of those API limits and the allocations that you have in order to extract information from Salesforce. Okay, so let's pivot and do a bit of a segue into the final leg of the triad, which is around availability. And so we talked about your integrity. You want to have a backup that is the full and accurate picture of your Salesforce org should there be a data corruption. But what do you do with that backup once you've extracted it from Salesforce? So let's take a look at this particular leg of the triad. So availability means the assurance that the information you have is trustworthy and accurate. Put plainly, availability means providing the uninterrupted access to your Salesforce users. So you might recall from an earlier discussion that we had, we as Salesforce customers are paying Salesforce to manage the availability of our orgs, right? And while Salesforce is reliable, it's not always on. I think it's 99.9% is the current guarantee that Salesforce puts out there. And in that 1%, there are scheduled maintenance periods and outages. We all remember Permission Geddon from now a couple of years ago that caused several days of downtime for some Salesforce customers. So when we talk about availability, we truly do mean the availability of the Salesforce database itself. And for most customers, we live with the 99.9. That is, we deem that that's good enough for us. But I do think it's important to ask the question, especially for mission critical applications like a call center or maybe any sort of operation that's running in a healthcare situation, just as an example, is 99.9% enough? Or do you need, for those mission critical applications, a solution that looks like Salesforce, but where you can read and write the data even in the 1%, 0.1% where Salesforce might be down? And that's a really big sort of meaty question, and it's would be a complex solution as well. But I think it's an important question to ask your business. And the way that I typically talk with folks about it is I break down what does 99.9% actually look like. Over the course of a year, 99.9% is almost 8 hours over the course of the year. And so are you as a customer comfortable with that 9 hours? Does that meet your requirements for your application? And what if that happened on the last day of the fiscal year? Would you be comfortable with that? So that's one concept down here on the third bullet around availability. But there's also more, I would say more commonly, customer-driven availability interruptions. So this is sort of bringing it full circle. This is the classic example of having a data loss or a corruption. And on the top of the screen, what you'll see is what actually happens when there is a data loss. It's not just a one point in time and then your Salesforce data is back up and everyone's happy. There's actually multiple pieces that we'll talk about that go into what happens when a data corruption occurs. So there's two terms that I'll introduce you to if you haven't heard them yet. And again, these are industry standard. This is not Salesforce lingo, but there's the concept of a recovery point objective. So recovery point objective is essentially how far back do you have to go to get that clean backup of your data? So if a disaster hits on a Friday and your last backup, whether it was the weekly export or your own homegrown solution or another tool, if the last backup happened on Sunday night, you would potentially be losing a whole week's worth of business data. So, what are the requirements for your recovery point objective? Do you need to have, does it need to be a day? Are you comfortable losing a day's worth of data? Or do you need to have an even more robust backup solution that's backing up information, I don't know, every 15 minutes, every 40 minutes, something like that? And you would then use whatever backup that you have from the recovery point objective that you've identified and use it to push the data back into Salesforce. And as we've learned, right, the way that you get information out and the way that you get information into Salesforce is only via the APIs. So this is another great question to ask and think about with your business. How comfortable are we with using the data loader to load our, millions of CSV, millions of records back into the system? How would that look? How much time would that take? And how much downtime would there be between when the disaster hits and when your system is fully up and running with your business critical data that you need to run? So the main concerns around availability are truly this idea of high availability of Salesforce and also restore. However, large data volumes play a huge role in this recovery time objective. So, are your data volumes preventing access to inserting the records via the API? So, you need to have a plan about how you can most effectively use the APIs to insert the data. As an example, maybe you would be using SOAP API to insert records if you were dealing with a handful. But if you're working with millions and millions of records, you'll want to absolutely look into using the bulk API or even the newer bulk 2 API, all which come with their own sets of limits. And understanding the limits is actually a bit more in depth than just knowing the fact that you can process X number of records on a 24 rolling hour period, because there are also some limits around different operations. So with the bulk API, there's a limit around how much data you can ingest in a particular bulk operation. So being very familiar with the limits and sort of the constraints that we work within in order to get your recovery time objective is a very interesting conversation, and a conversation that should be had with your tech team and definitely your businesses as well. And one final point around availability, it's not on the slide, but I do want to add it. One of the common pitfalls that I see, especially around large data volumes, are customers wanting to keep every piece of data in Salesforce, because while knowing your customer, as we talked about at the beginning of the presentation, the whole reason we're collecting data is to have a better view to your customer. And knowing your customer is absolutely the end goal. But keeping every piece of information that's ever happened in Salesforce can actually cloud that view of the customer and has a drastic impact on availability. Looks like a cluttered org, and maybe there's some performance slowdowns. So you can actually see availability impacts when viewing a report or when trying to save a record. So another topic definitely to put in your toolkit and to ask questions about is the concept of archiving and data lifecycle. So do you want to remove data from Salesforce to free up space? And do you want to also preserve a copy of that somewhere that can be later unarchived by an administrator if needed? And that, again, is a conversation and a strategy that would need to revolve around using the Salesforce APIs, because you would be using Salesforce APIs to extract the data, and then also if you were saving a copy, and also to apply the delete. So understanding how that would look with millions and millions of records is a conversation to have. Okay, so in summary, you are responsible for the security of your Salesforce data. I hope that that point came across clearly. Now more than ever, with the retirement of the Salesforce data recovery service that retired last year. That was the sort of last line of defense for data recovery, and that's no longer something that Salesforce supports. But luckily, it's not all bad news. There are existing best practices. There's frameworks like we talked about, so you can start asking the right questions about your data security and data protection. And then there's also an ecosystem full of partners and experts who can help advise you, who have tools and things like that. And then I do hope that you'll take away from this presentation that data protection and data security is actually and data in general in Salesforce is actually quite an interesting architectural topic. And it truly does, like any good architectural consideration, it comes down to trade-offs. What RTO or RPO can you live with? Do you need to have a system for that 0.1% where Salesforce is down 9 hours a year? And then, yes, to reiterate that, I hope that you see that data protection is actually a very interesting topic to think about. And with that, there are some resources that will be available to you about protecting your data, especially around large data volumes. So we hit on a lot of the high level concepts, but there is in-depth video and also resources here that I provided to you. And I think with that, just a final thank you to our sponsors, and thank you so much for listening. Hope to connect with you out in the Twitterverse sometime soon. Thank you.